The telegram that arrived at Jessica Thompson's office in Denver, Colorado, in the spring of 1882, was brief but intriguing enough to make her cancel her next 3 appointments. Someone in Williams, Arizona Territory, needed an antiquities appraiser, and they were willing to pay double her usual fee plus travel expenses if she could arrive within the week. Jessica had built her reputation as one of the few female antiques appraisers west of the Mississippi through sheer determination and an encyclopedic knowledge inherited from her late father, a museum curator in Boston. At 24, she had spent the last 6 years since his death establishing herself in a world that preferred its women silent and decorative rather than educated and self-sufficient. The generous offer suggested either desperation or genuine wealth, and either option intrigued her enough to pack her leather-bound reference books and magnifying instruments into 2 sturdy travel cases. The train journey south took her through changing landscapes, from Colorado's mountains to the high desert plateaus of Arizona Territory. Williams sat along the Atlantic and Pacific Railroad line, a growing town that served as a gateway to the massive pine forests covering the surrounding mountains. When Jessica stepped off the train into the bright afternoon sunshine, she was immediately struck by the crisp, clean air scented with ponderosa pine and the bustling energy of a frontier town on the rise. A young man in dusty work clothes approached her hesitantly. "Miss Thompson." "I am she," Jessica replied, adjusting the small hat perched on her carefully pinned auburn hair. "Mr. Dawson Fletcher sent me to collect you and your luggage. I am to take you to the Mountain View Hotel, where he has arranged accommodations. He asks if you might meet him at his ranch tomorrow morning at 9. Jessica had expected to be taken directly to view the antiques, but the delay was not unreasonable if her client lived outside of town. "That will be acceptable. Please inform Mr. Fletcher I will be ready at the appointed time." The Mountain View Hotel proved to be one of the nicer establishments in Williams, a 2-story wooden structure with glass windows and actual wallpaper in the lobby. Jessica's room was small but clean, with a view of the railroad tracks and the mountains beyond. She spent the evening reviewing her reference materials and wondering what sort of antiques a rancher in Arizona Territory might possess. Spanish colonial pieces, perhaps, native artifacts, or had some wealthy Easterner relocated west and brought family heirlooms. Sleep came fitfully, her mind too active with possibilities and the unfamiliar sounds of a new town outside her window. When dawn broke, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Jessica was already awake, preparing for the day ahead with the same meticulous care she applied to her work. The young man from the previous day arrived promptly at 8:30 with a well-maintained wagon. The journey out of town took them north into the pine forests, where the air grew even cooler, and the scent of evergreens became almost overwhelming. After about 45 minutes, they turned onto a private road that wound through a meadow dotted with cattle. The Fletcher Ranch revealed itself gradually, first a large barn, then several outbuildings, and finally the main house itself. Jessica caught her breath slightly at the sight. This was no rough frontier cabin, but a substantial 2-story home built of honey-colored wood, with a wide wraparound porch and large windows that would let in abundant light. Flower boxes adorned several of the windows, and she could see lace curtains inside. As the wagon pulled to a stop, the front door opened, and a man stepped out onto the porch. Dawson Fletcher was not what Jessica had expected. Perhaps in his late 20s, he stood tall and lean with the sun-bronzed skin of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, and he wore clean trousers with a pressed white shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows. What struck her most were his eyes, a striking gray blue that seemed to assess her with intelligence, and something else she could not quite identify. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice a warm baritone as he descended the porch steps. "I am grateful you made the journey. I hope your travels were comfortable." "Quite comfortable, thank you, Mr. Fletcher." Jessica accepted his offered hand for the briefest shake, noting the calluses that spoke of physical labor despite his evident wealth. "Your telegram mentioned antiques in need of appraisal. I confess my curiosity has been considerable." A slight smile crossed his features, transforming his serious face into something more approachable. "I imagine you were expecting an old prospector with a few dusty relics." "I try not to form expectations before meeting a client," Jessica replied diplomatically, though he had guessed accurately enough. "Please, come inside. I have coffee and breakfast prepared if you have not yet eaten." "The antiques in question belonged to my grandfather and were left to me upon his death 3 months ago. I honestly have no idea of their value or authenticity, but my grandfather was not a man given to collecting worthless items." Jessica followed him into the house, immediately noting the quality of the construction and furnishings. The interior was surprisingly refined, with polished wood floors covered by what appeared to be genuine Persian rugs. The walls held landscape paintings that showed real artistic merit, and the furniture, while sturdy enough for frontier life, had been crafted by skilled hands. Dawson led her to a dining room where a substantial breakfast waited on fine china. "My housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, prepared this before visiting her daughter in town. Please sit." The informality of dining with a client was unusual, but Jessica found herself accepting the offered chair. The coffee was excellent, rich and hot, and the food proved to be equally well prepared. "Tell me about your grandfather," Jessica said, deciding that understanding the provenance of the collection would help her work. Dawson leaned back in his chair, cradling his coffee cup. "Grandfather Horace was a complicated man. He made his fortune in shipping and trade in San Francisco during the gold rush days, not by mining but by supplying miners. He developed connections throughout the Pacific, particularly with merchants in China and Japan. When he retired in 1875, he moved out here, claiming he was tired of city corruption and wanted clean air." "That must have been quite a change," Jessica observed. "He bought this land and built this house but rarely invited anyone inside. I think he had been disappointed by people too many times." "I spent summers here as a boy, after my parents died when I was 12. Grandfather raised me from then on, taught me how to run cattle, how to judge the character of horses and men, how to keep accounts." Dawson paused, looking out the window. "He died in January, and the house became mine along with everything in it. It was only when I started going through his private study that I discovered he had been collecting objects for decades." "What sort of objects?" "That is precisely what I need you to tell me. I know enough to recognize quality when I see it, but not enough to understand what I am actually seeing. Some pieces have Asian characters I cannot read. Others appear European. A few might be simply very old. I need to know what I have, what it is worth, and what should be done with it." The vulnerability in his voice surprised Jessica. This was a man who clearly ran a successful ranch and managed his affairs competently. Yet he was willing to admit ignorance in an area outside his expertise. It was refreshing compared to many men she encountered, who would rather make costly mistakes than admit a woman might know more about something. After breakfast, Dawson led her upstairs to what he called his grandfather's study. The room was large, occupying what must have been 2 smaller bedrooms combined into one. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 3 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes in multiple languages. A massive desk sat near the windows, and scattered throughout the room were display cases, cabinets, and various objects carefully arranged on tables covered with protective cloth. Jessica set down her cases and simply stood for a moment, taking it all in. Then she moved to the nearest display case and felt her breath catch. "Mr. Fletcher," she said carefully, "do you have any idea what this is?" He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell pine and leather and something uniquely him. "A vase. A Ming Dynasty vase, if I am not mistaken, from the reign of Emperor Jiajing, which would make it approximately 300 years old." She bent closer, examining the delicate blue and white porcelain. "The condition is remarkable. Is it valuable?" In the right auction house in San Francisco or even New York, this single piece could bring several $1,000s. Dawson was quiet for a moment. "There are 4 more similar vases in that cabinet behind you." Jessica turned slowly. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of discovery. Horace Fletcher had indeed been a collector of extraordinary taste and resources. Japanese woodblock prints by masters whose names made Jessica's heart race. Chinese jade carvings that belonged in museums. A collection of European snuff boxes that appeared to include pieces from the workshops of Fabergé. Illuminated manuscripts that could have graced monastery libraries. Antique weapons with jeweled handles and Damascus steel blades. By noon, Jessica had to sit down, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was seeing. "Mr. Fletcher, this collection represents not just wealth but art history. Your grandfather must have spent decades and a considerable fortune assembling these pieces." Dawson had been watching her work with fascination, noting how she handled each object with reverence and examined it with tools from her cases, making notes in a leather journal in her precise handwriting. "What should I do with it all?" "That depends on what you want. The monetary value is substantial, easily in the hundreds of thousands of dollars if properly sold. But beyond money, this is a collection that tells stories about art, craftsmanship, and human creativity across centuries and continents. It would be a shame to simply disperse it." "I do not need the money," Dawson said. "The ranch is profitable and grandfather left me well provided for, but I am not knowledgeable enough to be the steward these objects deserve." Jessica found herself warming to this rancher who could have simply sold everything for profit, but instead worried about stewardship. "You could donate the collection to a museum. They would preserve it, study it, and allow the public to appreciate it. Or you could keep it as your grandfather intended, perhaps learning about each piece yourself." "What would you do?" The question was sincere, his gray-blue eyes seeking her opinion with genuine interest. Jessica considered carefully. "I would want to understand why he collected each piece. There is usually a story behind every acquisition. Some collectors simply want to own beautiful things, but I suspect your grandfather was more thoughtful than that." "His journals," Dawson said suddenly. "He kept detailed journals. I have not read through them all, but he wrote something almost every day for as long as I knew him." They spent the afternoon locating and reviewing Horace Fletcher's journals, dozens of leather-bound volumes arranged chronologically on a dedicated bookshelf. Jessica found herself sitting beside Dawson on a comfortable sofa as they read through entries, their heads bent together over the careful handwriting. Horace Fletcher emerged through his words as a man of deep intelligence and deeper loneliness. He had lost his wife young, never remarried, and poured his grief into building a business empire that left him wealthy but isolated. The objects he collected were not trophies but connections to beauty in a world that had shown him harshness. Each acquisition came with a detailed entry explaining not just what he had purchased, but why it had moved him. "Listen to this," Jessica said softly, reading from an entry dated 1868. "Today, I acquired a jade carving of a scholar and his student. The merchant told me it was created during the Qing dynasty by a master who believed teaching was the highest calling. I thought of my grandson Dawson, how I am failing to teach him anything beyond cattle and accounts. How do I teach a boy about beauty and meaning when I scarcely understand it myself?" Dawson was quiet beside her. When she glanced up, she saw an expression of such raw emotion on his face that she instinctively touched his hand. He did not pull away. "He never said things like that to me," Dawson said quietly. "He was always gruff, practical. I had no idea he thought about such things." "Perhaps he found it easier to write than speak," Jessica suggested gently. "Many people do." They continued reading as afternoon sun slanted through the windows, filling the study with golden light. Mrs. Chen returned and quietly brought them tea and sandwiches, which they ate without leaving the sofa or their exploration of Horace Fletcher's inner world. As evening approached, Jessica realized she had spent nearly the entire day at the ranch and had barely scratched the surface of cataloging the collection. "I should return to town," she said reluctantly. "But this is going to take considerably longer than I initially estimated. To properly appraise and document everything here, I would need at least 2 or 3 weeks." "Then stay," Dawson said. "Not in town, I mean. We have multiple guest rooms and it would save you the daily journey back and forth. Mrs. Chen would be delighted to have someone else to cook for, and you would have unlimited access to the collection." It was highly irregular, potentially scandalous for an unmarried woman to stay at a bachelor's ranch, but Jessica found herself tempted. The collection deserved thorough attention, and the daily travel would indeed be inefficient. "I would need to maintain proper propriety. Mrs. Chen lives here. She has rooms on the first floor and has been with the family for 20 years, and I have 2 ranch hands who live in the bunkhouse. You would not be unchaperoned." Jessica made a decision that surprised herself. "Very well. I will need to collect my things from the hotel." "I will take you in the wagon now," Dawson offered, his face showing what might have been relief or pleasure or perhaps both. The ride back to Williams in the gathering dusk felt different from the morning journey. They talked easily about the collection, about Jessica's work, about Dawson's ranch. She learned he ran 200 head of cattle and was experimenting with breeding programs to develop stock better suited to the high altitude. He learned she had walked away from a comfortable life in Boston after her father died, because her relatives expected her to marry a man whose greatest intellectual achievement was memorizing horse racing statistics. "You walked away from security," Dawson observed as they drove through the darkening forest. "I walked toward freedom," Jessica corrected. Even uncertain freedom was better than comfortable captivity. At the hotel, Jessica packed her belongings while Dawson waited in the lobby. The desk clerk raised eyebrows when she checked out early, but Jessica met his judgmental look with calm confidence. Let people think what they wished. She knew her own character, and increasingly, she trusted Dawson Fletcher's. The ranch house welcomed her return like a ship coming to harbor. Mrs. Chen, a small, energetic woman with silver threading her black hair and a face that creased beautifully when she smiled, showed Jessica to a guest room that overlooked the eastern meadows. It was furnished simply but comfortably, with a large bed covered in quilts, a writing desk near the window, and an adjoining small room with a wash basin and pitcher. "Breakfast at 7, Mrs. Chen said. "But if you need anything during the night, you call out. My room is below this one." That night, Jessica lay in bed listening to unfamiliar sounds, the wind in the pines, the distant call of an owl, the settling of the house's wooden frame. She thought about Dawson Fletcher, about his careful handling of his grandfather's legacy, about the intelligence in his eyes and the gentleness in his hands when he had helped her examine a delicate porcelain figurine. She thought about how natural it had felt to sit beside him, reading journals, their shoulders occasionally touching. This was dangerous territory. Jessica had built her life on professional competence and independence. Romantic entanglements compromised both. Yet she could not deny the pull she felt toward the rancher who quoted his grandfather's journals and worried about being a proper steward of beauty. The next 2 weeks fell into a pleasant rhythm. Jessica rose early, breakfasted with Dawson while Mrs. Chen fussed over them both, and then spent the morning in the study carefully cataloging and appraising items. Dawson had ranch work to attend to, but he often returned at midday to check on her progress and share lunch. Afternoons were sometimes spent continuing her work, sometimes reading more journals together, and sometimes, increasingly, simply talking. Jessica learned that Dawson had briefly attended university in San Francisco, studying literature and history before his grandfather's health had brought him back to the ranch. He had expected to resent abandoning his education, but discovered he loved the physical challenge of ranching and the satisfaction of building something tangible. Still, he missed intellectual conversation and the world of ideas. "You must find it lonely out here," Jessica said one afternoon as they sat on the porch drinking lemonade that Mrs. Chen had left for them. "Sometimes," Dawson admitted. "Williams has good people, but most are not interested in discussing Japanese poetry or debating the ethics of land ownership. They think I am strange for reading books and stranger still for not being married with children by now." "Why are you not?" The question escaped before Jessica could stop it. Far too personal for professional boundaries. Dawson looked at her with those steady gray-blue eyes. "I never met anyone who understood why those Ming vases matter more to me than adding another 100 cattle to my herd. Or why I would rather spend an evening reading than playing cards in a saloon. The women in Williams are perfectly lovely, but they want a certain kind of husband, and I am not certain I am him." "What kind of husband are you?" Jessica asked, her heart beating faster. "The kind who thinks a marriage should be a meeting of minds as well as hearts. Who wants a partner, not just a housekeeper or mother for future children." He paused. "What about you, Miss Thompson? You must have left behind suitors in Denver." "No one I could not leave behind easily," Jessica said. "Most men find an educated woman threatening rather than appealing. They want to lecture, not discuss. They want admiration, not honest opinion. Then they are fools." The simple declaration, spoken with quiet conviction, made Jessica's breath catch. The air between them suddenly felt charged with possibility and danger. Mrs. Chen's appearance with fresh lemonade broke the moment, but something had shifted. They both felt it. As Jessica's work continued, she made several significant discoveries. Among the grandfather's papers, she found bills of sale and correspondence that revealed Horace Fletcher had not just collected randomly, but had built relationships with dealers and scholars around the world. He had funded archaeological expeditions in exchange for first selection of artifacts. He had commissioned pieces from living artists alongside acquiring ancient works. The collection represented not just wealth, but a lifetime of passionate engagement with human creativity. "He was building something," Jessica told Dawson one evening as they dined together, Mrs. Chen having retired early. "Not just a collection, but a kind of conversation across time and cultures. Look at how he arranged things in the study, the Chinese scholar carving near the European books on philosophy, the Japanese prints depicting nature beside American landscape paintings. He was finding connections, common threads of human experience. "I wish I had known this side of him better," Dawson said quietly. "I saw the gruff rancher who taught me to mend fences and judge horseflesh. I never imagined this depth." "Perhaps he did not know how to show it," Jessica suggested. "Some people can only reveal themselves through their choices, their collections, their writings. Direct emotional expression is too difficult." "Is that true for you?" Dawson asked. Jessica considered the question honestly. "Sometimes. My work is safer than my feelings. An antique cannot reject me or judge me for being unfeminine. I would never judge you for being exactly who you are." The words hung in the candle-lit air between them. They were no longer talking about antiques or Horace Fletcher or professional matters. Jessica felt herself at a precipice, about to step into something that could change everything. "Dawson," she said, using his first name for the first time, "we should be careful." "I know." He reached across the table, his calloused hand covering her smaller one. "But I find myself not wanting to be careful. These 2 weeks with you have been extraordinary. Watching you work, seeing how your whole face lights up when you discover something beautiful, listening to your ideas, your passion for knowledge and artistry. I have never met anyone like you, Jessica." Her name on his lips sent warmth through her entire body. "I am supposed to be appraising antiques, not developing feelings for my client." "Have you?" Dawson asked quietly. "Developed feelings?" Jessica met his eyes directly. "Yes, against all professional judgment, yes." Dawson stood, still holding her hand, and gently drew her to her feet. They stood close together, and Jessica could see the rapid pulse in his throat, matching her own racing heart. "I am going to kiss you," Dawson said. "If you do not want that, please tell me now." Jessica could have stepped back, should have stepped back. Instead, she moved closer. "I want that." His lips met hers gently, at first tentative, as if she were as delicate as the porcelain she had been cataloging. But when Jessica responded, rising on her toes and threading her fingers into his hair, the kiss deepened into something that took her breath away. He tasted of coffee and possibility, and his arms around her felt like coming home to a place she had not known she was seeking. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Dawson rested his forehead against hers. "I am falling in love with you, Jessica Thompson. I know it is fast, I know it is complicated, but it is true." "It is fast," Jessica agreed, her voice shaky, "but I think I am falling in love with you too. I did not come here expecting this." "What do we do now?" Jessica stepped back slightly, needing space to think clearly, which was impossible when she was in his arms. "I finish appraising the collection properly. That is what you hired me to do, and I will not compromise my professional integrity even for this. I would never ask you to. And we take time to be certain this is real and not just proximity and unusual circumstances." "How much time?" Jessica could not help but smile at the impatience in his voice. "Finish my work here, return to Denver, and if we both still feel the same after a month apart, then we will know it is real." Dawson looked like he wanted to argue but slowly nodded. "That is sensible and wise, and I hate it." "I know. I hate it too, but I will not risk my heart or yours on something that might be temporary fascination." They stood looking at each other across the small distance Jessica had created, the candles burning low between them. Finally, Dawson said, "Then I will ensure that this month apart only confirms what I already know, that you are the partner I have been waiting for." The final week of Jessica's work took on new intensity. She completed her detailed catalog of the collection, prepared extensive documentation of each piece with provenance when available and estimated values, and drafted a comprehensive report outlining several options for Dawson to consider. Throughout it all, she and Dawson maintained professional boundaries during the day while allowing themselves evenings together, talking for hours on the porch or in the study, learning each other's minds and hearts. Jessica discovered Dawson had a dry wit that could make her laugh unexpectedly. He learned she had a terrible weakness for lemon cake and could recite Shakespeare from memory. They shared books, reading passages aloud to each other. They debated the ethics of land ownership in the West, the future of the railroad, whether Mark Twain was overrated. They talked about dreams and fears, about Jessica's desire to eventually open her own gallery and Dawson's plan to use part of the ranch for conservation of the ponderosa forests. Mrs. Chen watched them with knowing eyes but said nothing, simply ensuring they were well fed and occasionally chaperoning with tea at strategic moments. On Jessica's last night at the ranch, Dawson took her on horseback to a meadow high in the forest where wildflowers bloomed in profusion under a vast, star-filled sky. They sat on a blanket with a lantern beside them, and Dawson gave her a small wrapped package. "For the train journey," he said. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages blank and waiting. On the first page, in Dawson's careful handwriting, was a quote: "The best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt with the heart. Helen Keller." Below it he had written, "Write our story so we never forget how this began." Jessica felt tears prick her eyes. "Dawson, this is beautiful. You told me you find it easier to write feelings than speak them sometimes, so write to me while we are apart. Tell me everything you are thinking and feeling. I will do the same." They kissed under the stars, and Jessica let herself feel everything she had been trying to contain: the love, the hope, the fear, the longing. When they finally returned to the ranch house, both knew the month apart would be torture, but also necessary. The next morning, Dawson drove Jessica to Williams in a wagon loaded with her cases and the comprehensive report she had prepared. At the train station, they stood on the platform, the morning sun bright around them, neither wanting to say goodbye. "A month," Dawson said, holding both her hands. "I will write every day." "As will I," Jessica promised, "and then we will see if this is real." "It is real," Dawson said firmly. "But I understand you need to be certain." The train whistle blew. Jessica stood on her toes and kissed him once more, not caring who saw, then forced herself to board the train. From her window seat, she watched Dawson standing on the platform until the train curved away and he disappeared from view. Denver felt different when Jessica returned. Her small apartment above her office seemed cramped after the spacious ranch house. The city noise felt harsh compared to wind and pines and bird song. She threw herself into work, meeting with clients, conducting appraisals, but her heart was in Arizona territory. True to his word, Dawson wrote every day. His letters arrived like clockwork, thick envelopes filled with pages describing his days, his thoughts, his feelings. He wrote about the ranch, about decisions he was making regarding the collection, about reading his grandfather's journals and understanding the old man better through death than he had in life. Mostly, he wrote about missing her. Jessica wrote back with equal frequency, filling page after page of the journal he had given her, then copying selections into letters she mailed from the Denver post office. She wrote about her work, about the inadequacy of other clients after working with someone who genuinely appreciated her expertise. She wrote about walking past bookshops and thinking of discussions on his porch. She wrote about missing him with an ache that seemed to grow rather than diminish with time. 3 weeks into their separation, Jessica received a different sort of letter. Dawson had made a decision about the collection. Rather than donating it whole to a single museum or selling it piecemeal, he wanted to create something new: a small museum on the ranch property, open to scholars and the public, preserving his grandfather's vision of connections across cultures and time. But he needed help. Would Jessica consider leaving Denver and coming to Williams permanently, not as a hired appraiser but as curator of the Fletcher collection? And more importantly, as his wife, Jessica read the letter 3 times, her hands shaking. This was everything she had not known she wanted: meaningful work, true partnership, a man who valued her mind as much as her heart, a life built on shared passions and mutual respect. She sat down at her desk and wrote a single word on a telegram form. Yes. Then she began the practical work of closing her Denver affairs. She had built something here, but it was time to build something new, something bigger, something shared. When Jessica stepped off the train in Williams 4 weeks after she had left, Dawson was waiting on the platform. He looked thinner, as if he too had been unable to eat properly during their separation, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. They came together without words, his arms wrapping around her, her face pressed against his chest where she could hear his heart racing. "I missed you," Dawson said into her hair. "I thought I knew loneliness before, but these weeks without you redefined the word." "I know," Jessica whispered. "I kept thinking I was being foolish, that a month was nothing, but it felt like years." "It is real," Dawson said, pulling back just enough to see her face. "This is real, Jessica. I know. I never doubted it, not really. I just needed to be sure I was choosing clearly, not from proximity or circumstances, but from genuine love. And are you sure, completely?" Jessica smiled up at him. "I want to build this museum with you. I want to honor your grandfather's vision. I want to spend my mornings working with beautiful objects and my evenings discussing their meaning with someone who cares as much as I do. I want a partnership of minds and hearts. I want you, Dawson Fletcher." He kissed her right there on the platform, and if anyone in Williams found it scandalous, neither of them cared. They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch. Mrs. Chen cried happy tears and insisted on cooking a feast that could have fed 50 people. A few of Dawson's friends from town attended, along with Jessica's assistant from Denver, who had traveled down to witness the wedding and help Jessica transport the last of her belongings and business materials. Jessica wore a simple dress of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Chen had helped her select from the general store and altered to fit perfectly. Dawson wore a new suit that he tugged at uncomfortably until Jessica laughed and told him he looked handsome. The circuit judge who rode through Williams monthly performed the ceremony on the ranch house porch, with the pine forests as their cathedral and the mountain air as their blessing. When the judge pronounced them married and Dawson kissed his bride, Jessica felt a sense of rightness that went bone deep. This was where she belonged. This was who she belonged with. Their wedding night was spent in Dawson's room, which became their room, talking late into the darkness about plans for the museum, about their life together, about hopes and dreams now shared. When they came together physically, it was with tenderness and passion, discovery and delight, the natural culmination of the emotional and intellectual intimacy they had already built. The months that followed were busy but joyful. Dawson hired builders to construct a dedicated museum building on the ranch property, designed to Jessica's specifications for proper preservation and display. Jessica cataloged and prepared each piece of the collection for exhibit, writing detailed cards explaining not just what each object was, but why Horace Fletcher had chosen it, pulling from his journals to let the old man's voice speak across death. They worked side by side, planning and building, debating and deciding. Sometimes they disagreed, but they had both learned from difficult people in their pasts how to argue respectfully and find compromise. Jessica discovered that Dawson's instincts about display and presentation were often excellent, even without formal training. Dawson learned to trust Jessica's expertise completely, never second-guessing her professional judgment. The Fletcher Museum opened in the spring of 1883, exactly 1 year after Jessica had first received that telegram. The opening was modest by big city standards, but well attended by Williams residents, scholars from as far as California, and even a reporter from a San Francisco newspaper. Jessica gave tours, explaining the pieces and their significance, while Dawson managed the logistics and welcomed guests. In her opening speech, Jessica said, "This collection represents one man's attempt to find meaning and beauty in a world that had shown him loss and hardship." Horace Fletcher reached across oceans and centuries to connect with human creativity in all its forms. In opening this museum, we honor his vision and share it with all who seek to understand that art and beauty are not luxuries but necessities of the human spirit. There was not a dry eye in the building, including Dawson's. Later, when the last visitors had left and they stood alone in the museum, surrounded by the treasures that had brought them together, Dawson pulled Jessica close. "Grandfather would have loved you," he said quietly. "You understood what he was trying to do better than anyone, including me." "I think he brought us together," Jessica replied. "His collection, his journals, his vision. He could not show you how much he loved you in life, but he left you a legacy that led you to me." Life settled into new rhythms. Jessica ran the museum, welcoming scholars who wanted to study particular pieces and school groups from Williams who came to see wonders they could not have imagined existed. She corresponded with museum professionals around the country, building a network and reputation that brought increasing recognition to the Fletcher collection. She also began accepting private appraisal commissions again, traveling occasionally, but always returning home to the ranch in Dawson. Dawson continued managing the cattle operation, though he hired additional help so he could spend more time involved with the museum. He particularly enjoyed leading tours, having learned the stories behind each piece from Jessica and his grandfather's journals. He also began writing himself, documenting the history of the ranch and the Fletcher family, thinking perhaps future generations would want to understand their heritage. Their first child arrived in the winter of 1884, a robust boy they named Henry Horace Fletcher. Dawson was besotted from the first moment he held his son, and Jessica discovered that motherhood did not require sacrificing her professional identity. Mrs. Chen was delighted to help with the baby, and Jessica found she could work in the museum with Henry sleeping in a basket nearby, at least until he became mobile. 2 years later, a daughter arrived, whom they named Clara Rose. She had Jessica's auburn hair and Dawson's gray-blue eyes, and showed early signs of her mother's curiosity about everything around her. The museum continued to grow in reputation. By 1888, the Fletcher collection was mentioned in academic journals and guidebooks. Wealthy collectors sometimes approached Dawson about purchasing pieces, but he always refused. The collection stayed whole, as his grandfather had intended, speaking its silent language about beauty and human connection across time. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Dawson surprised Jessica with a gift, a jade pendant carved in the shape of a phoenix, symbolizing rebirth and renewal. "I saw this in one of the San Francisco shops where grandfather used to buy pieces," Dawson explained as he fastened it around her neck. "I thought of you immediately. You took grandfather's hidden treasure and gave it new life. You took my lonely existence and filled it with love and purpose. You are my phoenix, Jessica." Jessica touched the pendant, feeling its cool smoothness against her skin. "You gave me a place where I could be fully myself, where my knowledge was valued rather than seen as unfeminine or threatening. You gave me partnership and passion and a family. You, Dawson Fletcher, are the real treasure I discovered in Arizona territory." They stood on the museum porch where they had first discussed the collection's meaning, where they had stolen moments during her initial visit, where they had been married. The pine forest stretched around them, and inside the building, the objects that had brought them together waited in careful preservation. "You ever miss Denver?" Dawson asked. "The city, the opportunities there." Jessica shook her head. "Not for a moment. This is where I belong. With you, with our children, with this work that matters. I have everything I ever wanted and some things I never knew to want." As if summoned by her words, Mrs. Chen appeared at the door with 6-year-old Henry and 3-year-old Clara. Henry ran to his parents immediately, chattering about a bird's nest he had discovered, while Clara toddled behind, determined to keep up with her brother despite her shorter legs. Dawson scooped up Clara while Jessica listened to Henry's excited description. This, Jessica thought, this was the life she had chosen. Not the comfortable captivity of Boston expectations or the lonely independence of her Denver years, but this vibrant, complicated, deeply satisfying existence she and Dawson had built together. The years continued to unfold with their mixture of joys and challenges. A drought in 1889 tested the ranch's resources, but Dawson's careful management saw them through. A traveling exhibition borrowed several pieces from the Fletcher collection in 1891, bringing national attention. Mrs. Chen's health began to decline, and Jessica and Dawson cared for her with the same devotion she had shown them, ensuring her final years were comfortable and dignified. Another son arrived in 1892, named Thomas Edward, who proved to have his father's way with animals and his mother's meticulous attention to detail. The ranch house filled with the noise and energy of 3 growing children, and Jessica sometimes marveled at her ability to balance museum work, motherhood, and marriage, all while maintaining her own sense of self. "You make it look easy," Dawson told her one evening after a particularly chaotic day when Thomas had been sick. Clara had torn her dress climbing a tree. Henry had accidentally released one of the museum's carefully preserved butterflies from its display case, and a prominent scholar had arrived a day early for a research visit. Jessica laughed, exhausted but happy. "It is not easy. It is just worth it. Every complicated, messy, wonderful moment is worth it." As the 19th century drew toward its close, the Fletcher Ranch and Museum had become an established institution in Arizona territory. Young scholars came to study the collection. Families visiting the Grand Canyon often added a stop at the museum to their itineraries. The ranch itself remained profitable, and Dawson had implemented conservation practices that protected the pine forests while still supporting the cattle operation. One evening in 1898, Dawson and Jessica sat on their porch as they had countless times before, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. The children were asleep inside, and the world was quiet except for evening bird song and the whisper of wind in the trees. "Do you remember," Dawson said, "when you first arrived here, and I had no idea what grandfather had left me? You thought you were hiring someone to appraise a few dusty relics," Jessica replied with a smile. "Instead, I found a partner for life and a purpose I never knew I was seeking." Dawson reached for her hand. "That first day, watching you examine those Ming vases, seeing how your whole face transformed with recognition and wonder, I think I started falling in love with you right then. I thought you were remarkably handsome for a rancher," Jessica admitted. "But it was watching you read your grandfather's journals, seeing how much you cared about understanding him and honoring his legacy properly, that made me start falling in love." "We have built a good life," Dawson said softly. "We have built an extraordinary life," Jessica corrected. One that honors your grandfather's vision, that gives our children room to grow and explore, that allows us both to be fully ourselves while also being fully together. She thought back to that young woman who had boarded a train in Denver 16 years earlier, curious about an intriguing commission, but never imagining she would find her home and heart in Arizona territory. She thought about Horace Fletcher, the complicated man whose collection had become a bridge between his lonely life and future generations. She thought about all the people who visited the museum and found something that spoke to them across the barriers of time and culture. "You know what I realized recently," Jessica said. "In my final appraisal report, I estimated the collection's monetary value in the hundreds of thousands, but I never appraised the most valuable thing I found here." "What was that?" Dawson asked, though his eyes suggested he knew. "You," Jessica said simply. "The cowboy himself proved priceless. No monetary value could capture what you have brought to my life, what we have built together. Some treasures cannot be measured in dollars or placed in display cases. They can only be lived and loved and cherished." Dawson pulled her close, and they sat together as darkness fell and stars emerged one by one in the vast Arizona sky. Inside the museum building, the collection waited in careful preservation. Inside the ranch house, their children dreamed of their own future adventures. And on the porch, two people who had found each other through antiques and fallen in love through understanding sat in comfortable silence, knowing they had discovered something rare and precious. In the years that followed, the Fletcher family continued to thrive. Henry grew into a young man interested in archaeology, inspired by the artifacts in his family's museum. Clara showed artistic talent and spent hours sketching the objects in the collection, capturing their beauty in her own way. Thomas proved to be a natural rancher who also loved the museum work, suggesting he might be the one to eventually take over both operations. Jessica expanded the museum's mission, establishing a small conservation laboratory where she could teach proper preservation techniques to students. She also began documenting the provenance of pieces more thoroughly, sometimes traveling to trace the origins of particular objects. Dawson always supported these trips, though he missed her terribly and was always overjoyed when she returned. The ranch itself became known not just for cattle, but for Dawson's forestry conservation efforts. He worked with the newly established Forestry Service, pioneering sustainable practices that protected the ponderosa forests while still allowing economic use. The Fletcher Ranch became a model for balancing commercial interests with environmental stewardship. As the new century arrived, bringing changes and challenges neither could have imagined in 1882, Jessica and Dawson faced them together with the same partnership that had defined their marriage from the beginning. They consulted, they debated, they supported, they loved. On their 20th wedding anniversary in 1903, their children now young adults or near to it, Dawson took Jessica back to that meadow where he had given her the journal on her last night before returning to Denver. The same wildflowers bloomed, and the same vast sky stretched above them. "I have something for you," Dawson said, presenting a leather portfolio. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, documenting their life together. The museum opening, their children at various ages, candid shots of Jessica working among the collection, Dawson on horseback, the whole family on the porch. Each image was labeled in Dawson's careful handwriting with dates and brief notes. "You told me to write our story," Dawson said. "I have been doing that in journals, but I wanted to capture it another way too, so we never forget a single moment." Jessica looked through the photographs, seeing their life reflected back in black and white images. There she was, young and serious, examining a vase. There was Dawson, holding newborn Henry with an expression of wonder. There were the children growing, changing, becoming themselves. "It is beautiful," Jessica whispered. "Our whole life preserved like the antiques in the museum." "Not just preserved," Dawson said, taking her face gently in his hands. "Still being created. Every day with you is another piece added to our collection. Another moment of beauty and meaning and love." He kissed her with the same passion and tenderness that had characterized their first kiss 20 years earlier, and Jessica responded with equal fervor, grateful beyond words for the life they had built, the love they shared, the partnership that had transformed them both. As the sun set over the Arizona high country, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Jessica thought about that first telegram and the journey it had started. She had been hired to appraise antiques and had found something far more valuable. She had declared the cowboy himself priceless, and 20 years of marriage had only confirmed that initial assessment. Some treasures, she reflected as Dawson held her close, could not be bought or sold, cataloged or displayed. They could only be lived, day by day, moment by moment, through partnership and passion, through respect and romance, through the ordinary and extraordinary moments that made up a shared life. The Fletcher Museum stood as testament to one man's quest for beauty in a harsh world. The Fletcher marriage stood as testament to two people finding in each other what they had both been seeking, without knowing it, a true partner, a genuine love, a meeting of minds and hearts that transformed both their lives into something far greater than either could have created alone. In the gathering darkness, with stars beginning to emerge and the scent of pine sweet on the evening air, Jessica and Dawson sat together in the meadow, holding each other close. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new joys. Their children would forge their own paths. The museum would continue evolving. The ranch would face the changes that the new century brought to the American West. But tonight, in this moment, Jessica had everything she needed. The man she loved, the life they had built, the knowledge that she had chosen well when she stepped off that train in Williams so many years ago. She had come to appraise antiques, and had discovered that the greatest treasures were not ancient objects but present love, not things preserved behind glass, but relationships nurtured through time. Dawson Fletcher, the cowboy who had hired her for her expertise and won her with his character, remained priceless in her eyes. And Jessica Thompson Fletcher, the antiques appraiser who had agreed to catalog a collection and stayed to build a life, was equally priceless to him. Together, they had created something neither could have built alone: a museum that honored the past, a family that embraced the future, a love that sustained the present. And as they sat in their meadow under the vast Arizona sky, both knew that their story, which had begun with antiques and uncertainty, had become its own kind of treasure, valuable beyond measure and cherished beyond words.